Good to see you all here this evening. Welcome. My name is Rob Fisher. I'm an associate professor here at the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. And on behalf of our dean, Cleve Gilmore, who's at the back, I'd like to welcome you to the Mandel School and what I hope will be a really exciting and interesting conversation with Steve Mintner. As you may know, this is the final session in our three-part series that we do in the spring on nonprofit leadership, and we're finishing big tonight, so thank you for coming out. I want to share with you a little about what I've learned about Steve, and he's going to be sharing from his considerable experience in the civic space from his career tonight, and giving us some things to think about. But I spent some time investigating him. It's not hard. He's got a big track record out there. So many of you will know him from his nearly 3 decades at the Cleveland Foundation, including 2 decades nearly as its president and executive director, which he concluded in 2003. Prior to that, however, he was an undersecretary in the newly created U.S. Department of Education in the Carter administration. He also served as the Commissioner of Public Welfare in Massachusetts, and he was the Director of Welfare here in Cuyahoga County for nearly, he was with the department for nearly a decade and served as its director as well. He pursued this career in public service after earning a bachelor's in education from Baldwin-Wallace and his master's of Science in Social Administration here at what was then called the School of Applied Social Sciences, at what was then called Western Reserve University. Following his time at the Cleveland Foundation, just to bring us up to date, Steve has been an executive in residence and fellow at Cleveland State University in the Center for Nonprofit Policy and Practice, and he also served as interim VP for University Advancement. And he has served on a number of nonprofit and corporate boards that you can check out on his Vita. Similarly, he has received too many recognitions and awards to list here. I would just note that he holds 6 honorary doctorates, including one from Case Western Reserve University. In 2003, he received the prestigious Distinguished Grantmaker Award from the Council on Foundations for his lifetime commitment to philanthropy. And interestingly, the same award had been received by his predecessor at the Cleveland Foundation, Homer Wadsworth, in 1986 for his time. So Cleveland has long been recognized for its leadership in philanthropy. His work at the Cleveland Foundation, which we'll talk with him tonight about, reads like a listing of the major initiatives of this community over the time that he was there, including things like revitalizing the Playhouse Square District, creation of the North Coast Harbor, renewal of the Huff neighborhood, leadership in the arts, spawning what is now Arts Cleveland, and supporting the public funding for Cuyahoga arts and culture. Lesser known would be his push for funding for investments when the AIDS epidemic was occurring, at a time when it was that kind of funding was rare. He's always had a keen eye on the causes and implications of poverty, and had really a career-long commitment to investing in public education. Noteworthy in the poverty space, his time at Cleveland Foundation led to the creation of the Cleveland Community Building Initiative in 1993, which some would say later on spawned the creation of Neighborhood Connections, which is a small grants program that invests in citizen-led and community-based projects, which is considered a national model for doing this kind of community-engaged investment. He's also credited with, during his time there, for putting essential leadership behind this community's early childhood investments that started in 1999, which subsequently became Invest in Children, which is celebrating its 20 years this year. If you care about numbers, when he was the head of the Cleveland Foundation, he was at the helm while the foundation's endowment grew to $1.5 billion, tripling over his time as executive director. And he also led to the quadrupling of its annual grant making, up to $75 million a year by the time he had left. Steve is an Ohio native, Having been born the eldest of 8 children in Akron, he grew up in the turbulent times of the 40s and 50s, and in my reading, I learned that he was no stranger to overt racism in his upbringing, including a kind of notorious cross-burning incident at his family's property in, I guess, middle Ohio. And then later in high school, being denied registration at a hotel while on a high school orchestra trip to Columbus. But throughout his career, Steve has sought to work through that racial divide that haunts us and deal with the structural racism and its enduring effects. He and his wife Dolly, who departed this world in 2017, have 3 married daughters, and Steve has, I think, 5 grandchildren. Is that still correct? Okay, good.
I think it's over.
He and Dolly, whom he met at Baldwin Wallace, were married in 1961, despite an earlier declaration by Steve that he would be a bachelor the rest of his life, which there is a signed note from 1957 that someone made you sign on a trip to, I think, St. Louis or Kansas City, where you made this declaration, and they said they wanted to have a record of it so they could give it to you on your wedding day. And I'll finish my opening with a quote from Peter Goldmark, who was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, about Steve. And he said, "While he is a consummate professional, a careful consulter, a superb politician in the best sense of the word, and an accomplished consensus builder, these skills have been applied in the service of a heart that is passionate about justice and opportunity, and they have been motivated by an inner spirit that dreams and plans on a large and imaginative scale." So with that, please join me in welcoming Steve Minden. All right, so now the conversation begins, and I let Steve have a few questions up front, but the questions he hasn't seen are the ones you're going to ask when we get to the Q&A. So please hold those, and we'll have time for him to engage with you. I'd like to start and get us framed for how did Steve Mintner become this guy? And everything I've read about you, I mean, the titles that they give things where you're discussed, things like history makers, change agents, a lot has been credited to you, and one of the first things I saw is he will quickly divert those compliments to the people around him. So I know you value good boards and good staff and all your partners in this. But I guess, could you just start us off with talking about how your upbringing informed your values that you brought to your life of service?
Well, first of all, my pay is getting that write-up that you just... I want to put that in the scrapbook and in the archives. It was very generous, and you obviously did a lot of homework. You know, it's very interesting. I think what I might have said if someone had asked me that 30 years ago is different than what I'd say today, because I've now done a lot of reflection, having just not too long ago celebrated my 80th birthday. So to look back. And I really have to genuinely say that so much of the person that I am today is that I'm the product of my parents, my mother and father. My dad came north as part of the Great Migration. His father came to Barberton, Ohio, where he worked in a foundry, had 6 children. My dad was the oldest, and he had 5 sisters. That becomes pretty important. And my mother came to Kent, Ohio, as a 5-month-old whose parents could not take care of her, so they asked, Mrs. Greenup asked her sister to take care of my mother, and she came to Kent. And when the time came to return her to New Orleans, my mother, then 4.5 or 5, said absolutely not. She wasn't going anyplace. She was going to stay in Kent. Both of my parents dropped out of school in the 12th grade. Both of them stated it was largely due to the impact, overall impact of the Depression. But both of them were very strong personalities. Very quickly. My dad, very strong personality, talented, could do anything, Golden Gloves, boxer, came within one fight of going to the 1936 Olympics as a light heavyweight. Worked in Akron and Firestone and a lot of different jobs where he was the first black person, Negro, colored, to do things. Incredible person. He only had one slight flaw. He did not like to have a boss. He wanted to do things and do it his way and so forth. The result of that was, example, he was the first black coal delivery driver in the city of Akron. Great story. I don't have time to tell it. But that experience was they needed drivers. It was the war years. There were men really, there weren't that many men around because they were in the armed forces, but he already had 3 dependents and they wouldn't take him. So they kept advertising saying, we need coal delivery drivers. We need them right now. So he showed up, said, I'm here. I understand you need somebody. You need them right now. And the new young manager said, well, Mr. Minard, take this home and fill it out and send it back and we'll take a look at it. And his response was, hell, I can fill this out right now. Well, that's not what the man wanted to hear, right? So he filled it out and handed it to him, and the young manager, as my dad told over the years, didn't know quite what to do. And my dad said, well, what's the problem? I mean, is there anything? Well, no, we're just thinking about, well, hey, I'm ready. So finally, he sent him out to the garage to meet the foreman, and he started delivering the coal, but was aware of the fact that he was always being watched. Finally said, why are you out here in the garage watching me? He said, well, I didn't know that I'd have my job. Now, no one ever told me you don't hire colored, but I kind of understood, but he didn't know what to do. Now, a few months later, they got a new foreman out in the garage who wanted my dad to do things a certain way. And he said, well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, aren't you satisfied? Aren't I doing the work? Well, no, nevertheless, I want you to do it my way. And my father's response, as you can probably guess, was, well, take your job and shove it, okay? So that began the odyssey. I'm the oldest of 8 children. I went to 6 elementary schools by the end of the first 6 weeks of the 5th grade because we moved here in Northeast Ohio to a number of little towns. My dad would start the job and go to work. My mother would go to the school. We were one of the very few minority families. She'd go into the school and they would be stunned when, after registering them, she then wanted to know what could she do as a volunteer. I mean, this is 1943, 44, 45. They were not used to some colored woman coming in here volunteering to be. And the second thing she'd do is go find a church. Encapsulate this story. My parents moved around. When I talk about, how many of you are natives of Northeast Ohio? Akron, Copley, Kent, Ravenna, Garrettsville, Windham, Warren Township, and Kinsman, Ohio. That's my background. Okay. I went from one school to the other. I didn't realize it until thinking back that my parents' attitude was, we're not going to stop ourselves. It's upon somebody else. Okay, and then we're going to do something about it. So that was one. The second thing, and I'll stop. Along the way, my family moved to Braceville, Ohio, on the main route. I think it's 88. And rented a house in August. And within a few weeks, school was to start. And a quarter of a mile away, the little proprietor who ran the grocery kept saying to my dad, well, I'm not sure they're going to let you stay there, you know. I'm not sure you're going to go to school from where you're living. Now, you had to understand, Braceville had a significant number of colored persons, but they lived on that side of the tracks. No, you're not supposed to live on Route 88, I think it is, and go over the tracks and go to school. So a few nights before school started, my parents came up the back steps with little jackets for us. Be quiet, don't say anything, just go down to get in the car, okay? And out in the side yard and in the front was the Klan, backed up by the sheriff's department, okay, with the crosses. We were taken to Akron. My dad came back. There was a standoff for a day, 2 days. A truck pulls up in the yard, a kind of a moving van truck. White man gets out, comes up. My dad said, don't come up on these steps, you know. No, Mr. Minner, I want to talk to you. I'm not with them. I live in Windham Township, about a mile away. You're not going to win this. This is going to go badly. On my property, I have 2 houses. The second house is as good as this house you're in. Whatever the rent you are paying, you pay me. Let me help you move. Now that's a powerful, powerful story or an experience over the years, right? Both sides, right? Overt discrimination, racism, so forth. White person saying, I'm not part of that. We're going to do things differently. So, therefore, as we moved and went different places, and we ended up in Kinsman, Ohio, where we're the only black family in the township. And as it turns out, I'm the only black person who ever graduated from the Kinsman schools in all those years, because they consolidated the schools in the 60s after I graduated in 1956. So I'm in the Kinsman Hall of Fame. One of the great figures. And I was introduced one time at a thing of, we have 3 people from Kinsman, Ohio who are, you know, well known. The first is Clarence Darrell. The second was Ray McKinley, who was an American League umpire. And the third is Steve Minter. So there you are. But so you ask about what shaped me. It was, you go do things, let others stop you. Don't let others and their reactions and so forth and so on inhibit you from doing things. And that's really the basic explanation.
So as you got a little bit older and you graduated from high school, then you went on to Baldwin Wallace and studied education. And I think those of us that teach in schools of social work, we believe that people have a spark that lights within them and calls them to social work, that they feel that draw. Could you tell us a little bit about your path to a social work graduate degree? Was it like that?
Absolutely not. So here I am. I go to college not because that was something that was on my radar screen at all. It was small town, small school system. I was a general business major. My parents hadn't gone to college. Kinsmen, not very many people kids went to college. There were 4 out of 16 in my graduating class. So that was not on the radar screen. But the superintendent of schools was my Sunday school teacher in the Methodist Church. And the teacher who influenced me the most was the general business teacher, who also was a pillar of the Methodist Church. And my family was in the Methodist Church. So Mr. Titus says, "Where are you going to college?" Calls Mrs. Garlock down to the office and says, "Gene, he's going to college. And he's going to report to us every 2 weeks. And you'd get up to the library and start going through some catalogs," which I did. I also worked at the post office in the mornings as a custodian before going to school. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole, but the end of it was a few weeks later, in early November, Mr. Titus, after Sunday school, says, "You didn't talk to me this week. Where are you going to college? What catalogs have you been through?" So I told him. And I mentioned that my father had read about Baldwin Wallace College and the Cleveland Plain Dealer and a truck stop in Conneaut. He was an over-the-road steel hauler. And an article in the Plain Dealer sports section about Harrison Dillard, okay, the great Olympian who won in 1948 and 1952. And he said, "That school's up there somewhere by the airport." So I mentioned it. That afternoon, our young pastor came out to our house and said, "I'm to pick you up at 8:30, you and your mother up at 8:30 in the morning, and we're going to visit Baldwin Wallace." Baldwin Wallace said, "You wouldn't be the first person who wanted to go to college who didn't have any money. Fill out the application and send it in." A couple weeks later, I was accepted. Well, what did I want to be? Guess what I thought? A teacher, like my general business teacher. Anyway, I majored in health and physical education and almost majored also in history. I met Dolly. We were an interracial couple at Baldwin Wallace. Obviously, we wanted to stay together. The most wonderful thing happened. In April, I was offered a position in the Cleveland Public Schools as a teacher who would be placed at John Hay High School and teach social studies. Then something happened that was unexpected. In May, I got a call from the registrar's office who said, "We got good news and bad news for you. The bad news is you failed to take a required American history course. The good news is you can take it in summer school and graduate on August 1st. I called the Cleveland schools, let the people know who had interviewed me, "No problem, come in and sign your contract the first Monday in August." On the first Monday in August, I came in to sign my contract. The person I was supposed to meet with was ill. The person that I met was the head of the department. He wondered why I was there, and I told him I'm here to sign my contract and all these things. And after 20 minutes, he came back and said, well, I'm the head of the department, and I don't know how this happened, but you ain't getting any job here in the Cleveland Public Schools because there are so few jobs available for Negro teachers and coaches. So if there's a job open, I'm going to give that job to one of my boys and girls who came out of the Cleveland schools and was a good athlete, and I'm going to look out for them. And sorry, no job. I had 30-some interviews over the next 3 or so weeks, okay? But what we found out, and people were helping, is that the jobs for blacks were in the urban centers, and they were filled. And I went through the experience of, oh my goodness, we knew something was wrong. You know, it wasn't that there were not jobs. This is, 1960. I'll never forget going to Talmadge, where I was met by the superintendent of schools at 9 o'clock in the morning. And by 9:45, I was trying to console the weeping superintendent who said, we just can't do it. I know the board would never approve this. Now, walking across the campus, I ran into the president's secretary, Miss Riegler, and Miss Stiefel. Told them, they said, oh, well, that's terrible, so forth and so on. Miss Riegler said, well, maybe you should be a social worker. I'll get an appointment for you at the county welfare department. And I went and had a nice interview. And Mr. Strelick said, I mean, I think you really want to be a teacher. Now, what could I say, right? I mean, it was interesting. I didn't really know anything about it. I think you really want to be a teacher. So I'm not hiring you in any way. I don't like people from Baldwin Wallace. Fast forward, universities didn't start colleges until middle of September then. It is now September the 5th, 1960. I'm walking back across the campus because I worked year-round on campus. I run into the same two women. How's it going? I tell them. Miss Riegler says, that's incredible. I can't believe that. I get in the truck that I'm driving. I go back to stop at the fraternity house to see if there's any mail. The telephone rings. The lady says to me, Mr. Minter, can you be here at 8:30 on Monday morning? Of course. And so I showed up at 8:30 on Monday morning. My supervisor had just left for vacation. So I went to another supervisor who said, well, I'm not going to, they didn't have orientation and training. I'm not going to mess you up, so just sit by Mr. Johnson, your desk mate, and start. And the telephone rang, and he handed me the phone. And I said, yes, hello, Mr. Minter. And he said, well, this is the Strand Hotel. You better get down here right away. Your client died. That was my orientation. About a month later, I'm downstairs doing something in the housing department, and I look up and I see this little sign on the director's door, Miss Riegler, the sister of Miss Riegler at Baldwin Wallace College. And so I then learned the story. Miss Riegler got a call from her sister, and she had been secretary to Mr. Schaefer for many years. She walked into the personnel director and said, are you going to do something about this, or do I do it? And so I got a call. So that's how I became a social worker. My first day on the job, I mean, I believe in the Holy Spirit, my first day, there is a celebration that goes on all day long. Why? The state of Ohio had gotten a new program with the federal government whereby they would pay pay a stipend if you got admitted to an accredited school of social work, and in return for each year of your education, you agreed to come back and work commitment. And on that day that I started, 7 persons left the department to come to this school to get their master's degree in social work. Some of you would recognize some of the names who've been around a long, long time. Lois Hefner, Nansella Wilson Harris, Libby Fleury. I mean, it was so before I knew what my job was, I knew that, oh, if that's what it takes, how do you get to do in this program? And the answer was, pass the civil service exam, apply to graduate school, and I was in the next year's class. So then I found out it didn't take me very long from the Strand Hotel. I was moving, I had a caseload of 100 clients, 60 single men, 40 AFDC families. We were largely moving persons out of the urban renewal area of St. Vincent's and what we would call Erie View. And my AFDC mothers lived in the housing projects and in Little Hollywood in Huff. And boy, I was off to the races. And I learned such an enormous amount during that period of time.
Okay, so now the confession. This was a test to see whether the fake news had overtaken and created this story in your past about how you came to social work. So apparently it's all true, because you have just confirmed the story I read.
And when I arrived at SAS, the first question I was asked is, well, what concentration are you in? I don't know, I'm a caseworker. That's what I didn't even know there was anything called group work or community organization. I was in casework. And the second question asked was, and where's your field placement? And I'm going to be at the juvenile court. And then they said, oh my God, Mr. DeSanti washes a couple of people out of that program every year. I mean, so I had a great time.
Well, it's very heartening that in 50 years we still use the same 2 questions. We're consistent. All right, so I know there's a lot that we could spend the whole time talking about your time in the welfare department here in Cuyahoga County during the time of the 60s. I think I want to ask you to, in when I moved to Cleveland in 2001, one of the first names I heard was Steve Mintner. He's the head of the Cleveland Foundation. He's like you just up and popped up, and all of a sudden you're the head of the Cleveland Foundation. I guess the question is, what in your career before that, how did that prepare you to be in philanthropy, and particularly to lead a massive, well-regarded community foundation and take it to another level? And I'm using that with the ear to a lot of our students are thinking, I'm going to spend my life in one kind of work, and maybe have never considered that somebody who starts in casework would find his way to a very different venue. So I wonder if you could talk about what that early career was like and what you took from it.
Well, keep in mind I started in September of 1960. What happened in November of 1960, for any of you who are historians, the history folks? What happened in November of 1960? There was a national election. Who became president? John F. Kennedy, the new frontier, right? A whole different sense of the possibilities, the Peace Corps, so forth. I was blessed. I was in the right place at the right time, and I was lucky. And I built I was able to build on some innate skills that when I go back now and you say about my parents, you know, I'm saying, you go do things. You don't sit back. You put yourself out there, all right? That is, I've always been fascinated by, how did you get in that position? What's the organization? What's the structure? Who are those people up there on the stage? Kind of, how did they get there, all right? So, I'm very fortunate. In October or early November of my first year on the job, second, third month, the Ohio Welfare Conference is being held in Columbus, and members from the department get to go. And somehow, I got to go. And I'm very interested in the stuff I'm doing, but I'm fascinated by the people who are up there on the stage and the things that they are talking about and doing. How many of you been to conferences where the conference ends with somebody making a pitch and saying, you know, you could be a member. We have committees. You could join if we'd love to have you. So I went up and signed up. And a couple of weeks later, I get this nice letter inviting me to be on this committee for the Ohio Welfare Conference that's going to meet 3 times a year in Columbus. And I take it to my supervisor, Mrs. Voloshin, who says, oh, this is wonderful. You know, this is the first time I've had a worker who, you know, been asked to do. Well, it created a real dilemma in the department. Steve Minter, who hadn't even passed the civil service exam yet, has been asked to be on a committee, and he wants to be on the committee, right? And so it had to be explained to me, Mr. Minter, you need to understand, you have to take your turn. And we don't know how we can pay for this. I mean, you know, this will have to go to the county commissioners. And I had a long conversation with my wife, and we said, well, you just have to invest in yourself. So I went back the next morning and said, well, I'd be willing to take vacation time if you give me, you know, or permission to go. I can drive to Columbus. I'll pay my own way. It was sort of like, are you kidding? Nobody ever. And so there was a, you know, a conference and so forth, and 3 days later or so, the chief came and informed me that they had done some consulting with the assistant director in the county commissioner's office, and the commissioners would, since it wouldn't cost them anything, they, fine, take the time, we'll put you on the thing, and so so I went. A year later, I'm in graduate school. It's September or early October 1961. I don't know how it is now, but Tuesdays was the day all the students were there, and there was a period, seemed to be noon to 1:30 or something like that, downstairs. The National Association for Social Workers and the Welfare Federation, today called the Center for Community Solutions, leaders came to talk to the students. I won't get into the name, maybe later, but these were the great names, okay? Volunteer people, professionals, Tom McCullough, Leona Beavis, okay, for those of you who are on the faculty. And they said, we'd love to have students. You could be on committees. You know how many students took them up on that? Me. I won't name drop, but I will tell you, I can name the 8 persons whose that committee I was on in 1961. And I can tell you today, because of staying here in this area, where each of those persons have been, some still alive, and the impact they've had on this community, on this school. And in 2002, at the memorial service of Nancy Porter, at the memorial service of Frank Porter, she had died a few years ago. She had a great history with this school. 2002, 1961, I'm going through the line because I was a member of the same church with the family and being told, oh, we need to talk to you. We've got to talk to you tomorrow. Can you give us some time? You know, you're a very important person in our life. Bottom line, the Porter Fund left, the Porters left $90 million unrestricted to the Cleveland Foundation, and the children were clear. It's because of you and what they think of the foundation. And it's because in 1961, that committee I was on had Nancy Porter. And in 1968, when we did the Health and Human Services levy, Nancy Porter was the co-chair for the department. And in 1970, when I left to go to Massachusetts, the person who presented me a distinguished award, all that was Nancy Porter. And the point is, people are watching. You put yourself out there, some opportunities are going to appear for you. That is, if I could say, I mean, I would like to talk about policy and so on, but the intersection of public policy, service, philanthropy, and so forth is still relationships.
I think I'm going to think a little differently about my committee service from now on. All right.
And you have to, listen, it helped. It helped that this was the 60s. So I got a lot of opportunities, right? I mean, it was a time of civil rights. It was a time for, hey, we need to be more inclusive. It was a time for expansion. I mean, in 1962, we all suddenly were reading The Other America. Michael Harrington, 25% poverty. Cuyahoga County was one of the pilot food stamp counties. West Virginia, John led the way, but we were one of the pilot food stamp counties. We had the second or third largest Title V work experience and training program in the country. We had one of the strongest welfare rights organizations in the country. So I literally finished graduate school in June of 1963 and became a protective services caseworker, June. The following March, I was the assistant director of the Title V work experience. No, I was a supervisor, 64. In 65, I was the Title V work experience and training program assistant director. In 66, I was the director of the program. In 67, I was director and chief of the Bureau of Resources, which had child care, homemaker services, legal services, all those things. In 1968, I was the assistant director for family and children's. In January 1969, I was the director. I never stayed in one chair long enough for anybody to find out whether I was good at it. But I wasn't the only one, okay? I mean, it was a period when we were trying, when this, you know, we really had some momentum until Vietnam just sucked up the dollars and things made a change. So it helps to be in the right place. But I will tell you, from the course that I co-taught about relationships and networking, it's still a very strong thing. I could give lots of examples of the students that I had.
So you ended up spending about 15 years in public service, public governmental service.
Right.
Talk a little bit now to the transition to ultimately the Cleveland Foundation.
So I went from Ohio, a darn conservative state, but I learned a lot about administration and organization and so forth and so on. And I got into the national orbit I'll come back to that later, story. I got into the national orbit, and I think I began thinking, being exposed to things that are going on about policy, that, oh, being a county director is okay, I'm perfectly satisfied, et cetera, and I have a lot to do. And one day I got a telephone call from 2 former professors at SAS, Bob Morris and David Austin, who were involved with the welfare department in Massachusetts, and the governor was making a change and had asked them to be on the search committee. I won't go through all. Anyway, I ended up in Massachusetts because I thought, hey, bigger opportunity, I can be the boss, all right, of the state. There are things we can do and accomplish. And all the things I learned as a county director made me a superstar when I arrived in Massachusetts, which had had a state system which was city and town administrated public assistance and a state directed child welfare program. And these got merged, and the people who were running the department were child welfare people. And it was a very progressive state, and it was totally out of control, had no management. A new union had just come in. I had helped bring in the union into Cuyahoga County, whole great story. But I had the experience to do it, and I worked with a moderate Republican governor and some extraordinary people. And I had the chance to be really at the national level. So, I mean, how many persons get the opportunity to work with, you know, Burke, who was the first black senator since Reconstruction, Teddy Kennedy, John McCormick, Tip O'Neill, Joe Early, Mike Dukakis gets elected governor, asked me to stay on as Commissioner of Public Welfare, but I knew he was not the person I sensed he was not the person a lot of persons thought he was. He wasn't nearly as liberal as he appeared to be. So I decided it was time to move on. I came home one morning in December and said, honey, this is the weekend where I decide where I'm going next. I had 3 possibilities. Go to California and be Jerry Brown's director for the state health. Go to New York and be Hugh Carey's commissioner for social services. Or go to Washington, D.C. and be the deputy director of the Social Security Administration. My wonderful wife said, you know, I don't care where you go. We're going. But you know, when we moved to Massachusetts, you never asked me my opinion about it. Now, I'm perfectly willing to go where you want to go, but if continuity, you always said it was important for our children, then I want you to stay in one place for 12 years. You don't go to Sacramento, and you definitely don't go to Albany and think you're going to stay there for 12 years. You could do it in Washington, D.C., because there's a lot. And so I thought, okay, maybe I should put some cities back on the board. Maybe the regional cities where HEW and so forth is okay. And obviously Cleveland made a lot of sense. And 4 days later, I was coming to Cleveland to talk about a job where I would have been the deputy director of the Welfare Federation. And of course, you have to have a search committee, and the search committee says, after about an hour's conversation early in the morning, well, then we're done with this. You and Leona figured this out. We're gone. And so now I have the rest of the day. Well, what would you like to do? Well, I had recently been on a panel with the president of the Cleveland Foundation, Homer Wadsworth. And so I had lunch. And it was a very nice lunch. And they told me that it was great. They would look forward to working with me You know, I was at the Federation. And a few days later, I got a call from my friend Peter Edelman, who said, I don't know whether you know this, but the Cleveland Foundation is looking for a program officer in social services. They don't want to be accused of raiding and so forth, but maybe you'd like to explore this. So I came and I thought, would I rather give away money or request money? And because I was very involved with the American Public Welfare Association, I was clearly moving up the ladder and was probably going to be the next president of APWA, and the foundation made that possible. And all my friends thought I was crazy. Why would you leave an operation where you have thousands of employees, $1 billion budget, and go and share a secretary as the program officer in social services? But what the foundation stood for, and in terms of community and the opportunity to maybe try and make some changes in social services, and I'd had the experience of having gone to England to look at the implementation of the personal social services system in the UK. So I came back to Cleveland, and Homer, my boss, said, figure out what to do. So I consulted with John Yankee and Claudia Colton, and we developed a pilot project, which we got beat up pretty well over because we were kind of naive that we thought partnerships and all these things could play. But a lot of it has happened over the years, John, in terms of doing it. And so that's how I got to the foundation. And almost immediately it was apparent that something I brought to the foundation that was helpful was, having spent these 10 years in Cleveland and knowing everybody from the ground up and so forth and so on, so immediately was, you go hire a program officer in social service and move into the civic affairs and government thing. And suddenly here we are in school desegregation and the lawsuit and all of those kind of things. So my engagement, having worked for the county, but also having had some experience in the voluntary sector, in the nonprofit sector, helped immensely. So that's my story.
So I think what I'd like to do is maybe shift gears just a little bit and get you to reflect on kind of how we can think about the sector and philanthropy, kind of looking over your career, what you've observed, what things are still true, what things you see as issues we should give attention to, and maybe just frame it as, where do you see our biggest areas of opportunity for the sector to be more effective, more influential, have a greater impact on civic good?
From my own experience, the voluntary sector and the governmental sector are very blurred. There is so much interaction and codependence and necessary working together that I find it hard to think of this is the nonprofit sector and this is the public sector. Now, obviously, there are obviously enormous differences, but I mean, there are 1,500,000 nonprofit organizations in this country. If we think about this county that we live in, and the voluntary sector and the nonprofit sector, and then you add in philanthropy, and today we talk about it, you know, public-private partnerships. There's almost nothing that I can think of that the Cleveland Foundation has been engaged in where it is not involved at least two of the sectors, and often three, in order to get things done, okay? Are there differences? Of course there are differences. But when it comes around to you know, whatever it is. Schools, today, it isn't just the public schools anymore, right? It is the public schools, charter schools, vouchers. The most significant thing that probably has been done in, you know, here in Cleveland as it relates to school desegregation and attempt to try and build things. It takes a long time. Was working with Mayor White and being able to have the mayoral control of schools turned over. Today, if we talk about the Cleveland schools and their data, guess who helps the Cleveland schools substantially with the data, even as bad as the overall picture is? It's called the Breakthrough Schools. What are they? Nonprofit schools. Early childhood, the Cleveland Foundation, the county, and the private voluntary agencies. It's the only way. Housing, etc. Let me flip back. One of the things that helped me immensely understand the nature of what we were having to do in a community was going to the Cleveland Foundation and studying its history. And there, as I looked back on things, the first thing that hit me was I was working with the Special Committee on Criminal Justice. And we were trying to find grants and find the right consultants to help create the Cleveland Police Academy. Now, what did I find out? Oh, there was a study done when the Cleveland Foundation didn't have any money back in 1914 through 1920, didn't have any money, and Frederick Harris Goff, the president of Cleveland Trust Bank, passed the hat and said we should do community studies about the important problems in a community, and we're going to be influenced somewhat by the Russell Sage Foundation, which had been established many years before, and we're going to do community studies. And they asked the leadership of Cleveland, what are the things that are important? And one of those first things that I discovered was, by the way, there was these studies done on criminal justice between 1916, 17, and 1920. Police, prosecutors, courts, there were 5 of them, courts, and I'm leaving one out. And these studies, the study chair was Roscoe Pound, who was the dean of the Harvard Law School. And his assistant was a brash young law professor by the name of Felix Frankfurter, who went on to be on the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. You can pull those and go to the West Reserve Historical Society and pull it, the 5 studies. And about the police, guess what? They had to, their great claim was, we created a police academy, a training academy. And then guess what? In 1930, the foundation was helping them create a police academy. And guess what? At the end of the 60s, it was, we've got to create a police academy. And here we are in what's being worked on? Training of police. In other words, these are enduring issues. And you got to understand, you got to stay at it because they're always going to be these issues. What are they? Parks and recreation. Cleveland Foundation study led to the Emerald Necklace and statewide funding for parks and recreation. It's a study which was really to provide necessary social services and so forth for the Americanization of the Eastern European immigrant. In other words, all these major urban cities had all these folks coming from Eastern Europe, and what were we concerned about? Socialism. We've got to Americanize them, okay? Schools, 20-some volumes on the Cleveland public schools that led to it for a long time being one of the lighthouse school districts in the country. In fact, there is today a Cleveland conference, which is held every year, I think now in Chicago, about schools and school reform. There was a study in higher education. Should Western Reserve and Case Institute of Applied Sciences be merged? Wouldn't that make for a great University of Cleveland? And the recommendation was made in 1921. And it didn't happen. Do you know why? Because the Western Reserve faculty finally decided that the way things were, Leonard Case had such great power that undoubtedly the school would be named Case. And the Case faculty did their homework and said, guess what? Most of the faculty at both of the institutions came from Yale. And when the Yale Divinity School and the Sheffield School of Engineering merged, they called the school Yale, and nobody knows anything about the Sheffield School of Engineering. So this is not going to work, and they decided to back off, even though it was recommended. And federation finally occurred in 1965, and a number of persons would argue that it wasn't until the late 90s that we truly became Case Western Reserve University. So I go through that because one of the things that helped me, persons say, well, what do you think are going to be the issues in 2025? I don't have a lot of problems saying education, and let's talk about the schools and parks and recreation and open space, and we're going to be dealing with the issues of the climate and the criminal justice system and how it's changing, et cetera. So that was a big help in terms of framework, economic development in neighborhoods.
That relates to something I read, and they said you said this, which is, I don't want to talk about what to do next for 30 days. So putting off the immediate, the fascination with the immediate, versus the kind of the hindsight, the beauty of hindsight. I want to make sure we have enough time to talk with the audience. I guess I'd like to take you to, you mentioned, would it be better to give money away or to apply for money? And so now think about your social work background and your life in philanthropy. And I wonder if you could talk for a few minutes about what social work needs to understand about philanthropy. For us to be more effective in our work, what do we need to understand about our philanthropic partners?
I knew you were going to ask that question.
I put it on the paper.
I know. And
you were hoping I wasn't going to get to it.
And I'm going to be candid. I've struggled with that. I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer that question because I will tell you, based on my experience, and I've co-taught the capstone course at Cleveland State in nonprofit management. Clearly, there is a difference in terms of those persons who are working at a more direct service level, delivering of service and so forth. But beyond that, I just frankly find it very hard to make a distinction between what folks in philanthropy, what folks in the nonprofit MNO program, and those of us who are social workers. If you're in the practice of doing something different, but when it comes to administration, government, governance, strategy, mission, community engagement, I think we're all doing the same thing.
Well, when you talked about collaboration, cross-sector collaboration, I heard two things there. One is it continues to be an opportunity. It's an opportunity to do great things by reaching across those lines, which may be artificial in some ways. The second thing is almost a caution, which is if you don't think that way or do that, you are potentially going to be less effective in your individual role and organizationally if you're not willing to go there in that partnership opportunity. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I cannot think of anything that I would be proud of, and my colleagues at the Cleveland Foundation in the period of time I was there would be proud of, that where we did something that we thought, hey, the foundation really made a difference, where it wasn't. Yeah. So did the mayor. So did the county commissioners. So did Eaton Corporation. So did BP. So did the Jewish Community Federation. I mean, I cannot think of anything that we did. Give you one story that perhaps illustrates this. I was the program officer at the Cleveland Foundation who, along with Hank Dahl at the George Gunn Foundation, who really spearheaded, and I drove the process related to Lexington Village, 79th and Huff, 183 market rate rental housing, first in 40 years in the inner city, $12.3 million project, 21 funders, Ford Foundation, LISC, Enterprise Foundation, George Gunn Foundation, Mandel Foundation, Eaton Corporation, Ohio BP. I could go on. We even got to a point that in order to really make this a nice project and put in some things that would really make these apartments stand out, we needed another $300,000 that we couldn't find. And I worked with the Jewish Community Federation and Bob Grease and others, and we had a meeting one day at the Union Club. Fannie Lewis and George Voinovich came. It was one of the most remarkable meetings because Fannie Lewis said, "Ooh, I wondered what was in here." And it was one of those meetings where we got to raise this money. Here's 25,000. Here, we'll put in 100 and to get to it. Now we've got it. We're going to have the groundbreaking. Huge announcement. I mean, this was a really big thing. I was exhausted. Sitting on my board was the publisher of the Plain Dealer, Tom Vail. I go over, I meet with the editorial department and so forth and so on. I say, the thing that is so important is there are 21 funders. So please, I know what the big names are going to be, but just put a box and list, okay? Well, it didn't happen. It ended up being broad headlines, Ford, Cleveland, gunned, so forth, and others. No box. I mean, I felt like, you know what? I ran into Del DeWint, who was then the chairman and CEO of the Eaton Corporation, and I apologized. And he imparted some wisdom to me that I lived with from then on. He said, Steve, you can't count on that stupid people over there at the newspaper. We know what we did. Eaton Corporation will get its credit that it wants. You know, I have a marketing staff and this and this and this, and we'll do it. So don't worry about it. He said, but also recognize this. Every organization that put money into this significant thing at Lexington Village is going to have it in their annual report, and they're going to explain how they helped leverage all the others. That was a powerful lesson for me, that how could you, one way of judging whether people felt good about or companies felt good about our foundations was to look at their annual reports. Okay. And to then constantly work to be sure that the credit gets passed around, or you help them, you know, for what they've done. And, you know, I can't think of anything in this town that we've accomplished that hasn't involved a whole lot of different persons and organizations and public figures contributing to it. That's really the sauce.
So last thing, I'm not going to ask this question, but I'm going to plant the seed, and that is, you famously to me, you said, being charitable is in the bone marrow of this city, about Cleveland. And when I think about that, part of that is our history, our legacy, and I guess I wonder where you are now. Is our marrow thinning at all? Or are we living true to that charitable past that we have that's rock solid? And I'm not going to ask you to answer it. Because I want to get the...
I have an answer, but
oh, you do? Is it a good... Well, yeah, let's hear it. Now you got the teaser. Okay, go ahead.
Some areas are thinning and some areas are thickening.
No. All right, I can't question that answer. I really want to move into getting some questions from the audience, if you're up for that. And I think Lauren has a mic, so if you would raise a hand if you'd like to ask a question. We need to get it on the mic so our streaming folks can hear it.
Yeah, I had a question that's been a concern in this particular area in terms of spatial displacement and regentrification, but it has become under different euphemisms such as urban renewal and community development, opportunity corridor, and so forth. Also, many of the projects met the issue around recidivism, and also the issue around unemployment at 18 to 24, 25, and the high level of homicides within the city of Cleveland. It's still been a problem even after some of these projects have come into fruition. And it appears to be there's still a template or a precipice relevant to the excommunication of indigent residents within the contiguous borders of this facility and the aligning borders of University Circle, Cleveland Clinic, and University Hospital, well, to the north of East Cleveland, Glenville, and Huff. Now, what can we do to make sure this excommunication and erasure of indigent bodies within these particular spaces? I know we've talked a lot, prideful, about community development and various different projects, but it seems to be a reiteration when it comes to poverty, in terms of or crime and recidivism amongst the African American population.
I'm so glad you're here for this.
Well, that's taking on the world, and I'm going to be a little bit cautious about that. Look, I think I started by saying, from my perspective, that my first caseload in 1960 largely was dealing with relocating persons from one area to another area. And little about that, a little more sophisticated now, little about that process has changed. I think we can, those of us who've studied these things can see what the inner city, so to speak, migration patterns have been, right? The flight to the suburbs, the disinvestment in terms of what happens. Small personal anecdote. My first apartment was at the corner of East 75th and Chester. If you drive by that southwest corner today, you will see a one building standing there, and then it's a lot. The twin was torn down. In September of 1960, when I moved in that building, it was a nice little parking lot. The telephone system was internal to the apartment. There was a doorman. It was a great place. My first paycheck, with my wife helping me, then my girlfriend helping me, I bought a Ford Falcon car. A few weeks later, my insurance on the car was canceled. I went to the Sears store on Euclid Avenue, talked to the Allstate people, and they said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. I mean, you are a college graduate, you're a professional, and so forth and so on. Here, we'll give you insurance." A few weeks later, my insurance was canceled. It was some years before I knew that it was called redlining, but where I was living was redlined. I got married in April. Dolly graduated from college in June, and we moved in June. Why? The telephone switchboard was gone. The bellman was gone. Somebody had been thrown out a window, etc. From somebody here at the Graduate School of Social Work, I took a job as a part-time, while I was in school, youth worker. It helped 3 Presbyterian churches in Glenville. By 1963, when I graduated, a daughter was on the way who would be born in October. We were very active in Glenville, in the Glenville Church. We looked at houses, but we ended up picking a house on, depending upon your point of view, on the first street or the last street in Shaker Heights, Menlo Road on Chagrin Boulevard. Why did we pick that house? One day our daughter was going to go to, we didn't know it was going to be a daughter then, one day our child was going to go to school. And what had been the history in Glenville and so forth and so on. Now, I state that because I made decisions which we felt was in our best interest. And what I learned at the Cleveland Foundation was that it was going to be a long path to turning things around that would make something in somebody else's best interest to be in the city. And that's long, hard work. Okay? So, I mean, today we talk about, oh, if only, why can't we have in Glenville a Tremont or a Detroit Shoreway or so forth and so on? Well, let me tell you, in 1975, they were busy saying, why can't we have, I mean, it takes a long time. At the Cleveland Foundation, when I came there in 1975, Herb Strawbridge, who was then the board chair of today what we call the Greater Cleveland Partnership, had introduced to the city a plan which was called the Dumbbell Plan, right? Have two anchors, and in between, Euclid Avenue. The Flats, which has gone through how many resurrections? University Circle, okay, and the Euclid Corridor. Most people thought, you're nuts. This is not going to happen. But it did. This community and other urban communities, but this community really got slammed with the decline of manufacturing. Okay? Suddenly those good paying jobs just disappeared. And we are still struggling, trying to find our way back to enough jobs at more than minimum wage, which is the base that you have to build on. I don't mean to be Pollyannish. It's really, in a way, remarkable what's happened in Cleveland over that 50-year period. But who could foresee the opioid crisis, the changes in corrections, sentencing, and all of those things? So my issue is, these are just enduring issues that we have to tackle. And we have to take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. And so, for example, we ought to have affordable housing. But I never was going to be one who's going to say, oh, you shouldn't do that there, that's going to lead to gentrification. We need those middle income jobs and so forth. And I think I could be very safely say, as a result of what has happened with the hospitals and so forth, who are the major employers, I live at Judson Manor. And I go out on the penthouse with our two local city councilmen and say, point them to, look to the west. Look behind where the clinic and the dental clinic is going. Look there. What do you see? Green space, open space. Let's work now to get a plan laid out that will include affordable housing and so forth and so on, because if you don't, in 10 years, that forested area is going to be gobbled up and turned into what? Yeah. It'll be gentrified. It's already happening. We're behind. So now the issue is, okay, let's get on top of what needs to happen in Glenville. Summer Huff is actually going to take care of itself. But it's still about what are the jobs going to be.
Do we have another question for Lauren?
Thank you. I'm wondering, what was the Cleveland Foundation's biggest mistake while you were there, and what did you learn from it, and how did you recover from it?
Whoa. I don't know that I can think of what was the biggest mistake. I mean, I think probably the generic answer I would give to you is during my time. We didn't think on large enough scale quickly enough and I think we were slow in really listening to the residents in terms of their feeling that they had suggestions that could be made, and they had some darn good ideas. Mentioned was of neighborhood connections. Well, how did neighborhood connections come about? After all, we were the most influential community foundation in the country and so forth and so on, and I'm very proud of what we've done. And then somebody suggested that we should ask other philanthropies and the people out in the neighborhoods and so forth and so on. It was painful getting the answer back, which is, okay, yeah, you're big shots, you're doing this, you get a lot of credit, but we don't know, out here in Fairfax, we don't see this, and you're not funding the things that are important to us, and you talk about community building, but... So in desperation, in a way, we said, well, why don't we take some of the money and turn it over to a group of the people in the community to design the program. And we got a shock. They said, thank you very much. We don't need you to help us. We can figure this out. We'll select the right people to sort of do what became neighborhood connections. But the biggest surprise of all was I would go to the meetings where they were having a community meeting, and someone of the persons on the board of the neighborhood connections would get up and explain what was going on and then tell people about the Cleveland Foundation. And damn if they didn't do a better job of explaining it than we were doing. And the kind of influence that it had on us. The other thing I think as we grew was having to remind ourselves that we didn't have all the wisdom, that these things got carried out with the community as a whole, and so therefore how we needed to develop a strategic plan, and we did. I led that in 1985, and we had measurements and all of those kinds of things. But you'd have to keep constantly asking, but what is most important? And sometimes the answer of what the community saw as being most important was different from what we saw in terms of some of our strategies. So that's how I would answer that.
I think we can sneak one more in if there, and then I'm sure we'll be available once we conclude, and Steve can take you out there.
From your youth experience of racism, what differences and similarities do you see from back then to today?
Well, you asked about my experiences, okay. Less overt, but still there in a very different, more sophisticated way. You have to remember, as is obvious, I moved very quickly. I moved up the ranks. I learned a lot about watching and trying to be aware of assumptions and how long it takes to change things. And let me just give you two examples. I mean, one of them is classic. I went to Massachusetts. What was significant about me going to Massachusetts? First black commissioner running this department. It goes back to the Board of Overseers of 1628 or something like that. I come in, I bring an executive assistant with me. There are probably 5% of the workers in the department were of color. No one in the commissioner's office or in headquarters, other than one person, was a person of color. So it was clear to me, you know, what it is I've got to do, what am I dealing with, what are people watching, right? And boy, anytime a person of color came to see the commissioner in August and September and October, it must be because they're about to get a job, whose job is gonna, you know, I mean, all of those things. One day, Monsignor O'Sullivan from Catholic Charities in Somerville comes to see me. I'm so glad you're here. You know, we have a great program that we're running in child welfare program, so forth and so on. We would like you to come and be our 75th anniversary speaker for Somerville Catholic Charities. Great, say I. I'm glad to do that. I walk out, and he suddenly says, "Well, Steve, have you been to Lake Street yet?" "No." "You mean you haven't been to see the Cardinal?" "No." "Well, we have to do something about that." And a week later, he takes me to meet Cardinal Cushing. Now, for those of you who are my age, wow. I mean, you know, going to Lake Street, Cardinal Cushing, the confessor for the Kennedy family, so forth and so on. I get ushered in. I thought Monsignor O'Sullivan would stay with me, but he didn't, so I'm now face to face with Cardinal Cushing, who proceeds to tell me that he's glad to meet me. He understands I'm a nice young guy. But he's really upset with the governor because for the first time in 50 years, a governor has failed to consult with him or his predecessor about who should be running the department. Because after all, it was a state-administered child welfare program, and the Catholic Church the diocese had great interest in what happened. But, he says, I've checked you out. Monsignor Ciolik in Cleveland says this. Father Camille in Cleveland says this. He proceeded to tell me. And of course, when I got out in the car driving back, suddenly I'm thinking, here I'm busy concerned about how these people are reacting to me and how the way I'm treating people of color and am I bringing them in. Hell, they weren't interested in that. They were concerned about what was I going to do with the Catholics in the department, okay? That was a great lesson for me. You know, you can make an assumption, okay? The other thing that about race and racism is epiphanies don't occur just like that. I had the good fortune of suddenly I'm the first African American CEO of a major organization, nonprofit. There was some payoff for that. You know what the payoff was? How do you think I got on 6 corporate boards? Often, several times, the second, in most instances, the first. Part of my concern was, I don't want to be a token. Okay? It is who's going to come afterwards. You know? And one of the things I had to learn, what I learned myself, in the United States Congress, how did Lou Stokes manage to do all the things that he managed to do? He got some seniority. And when he got to be a subcommittee chair or a committee chair, suddenly he was much wiser. Of course we can do this. So there were some instances where I sat for 7 years on the board as the only one. But I was a pretty decent board member. And one day I had seniority. And I was the chair of the Corporate Responsibility Committee. And now I was a senior member of the Compensation Committee. And you know what? Boy, did I become wise in a hurry. I mean, oh, yeah, well, that's a great idea. I mean, well, now we better think about bringing some other persons of color and women, you know. But suffice it to say, I was on the Goodyear board for 23 years, and I was on the Key Corp board for 19 years, and I was on the Dominion C&G board for 15 years, and I'll let you go back and check and find out. Or the things of subtle. One last example.
Your prerogative.
You want to hear a last example? I'm on one of these boards. It's actually the bank board. A committee is busy working, trying to figure out how we can help the Cleveland Public Schools and jobs and so forth for youth. And so we take a look at the Boston Plan for Excellence and so forth. And out of that, created the Scholarship and Escrow program for Cleveland Public School students. Youth Opportunities Unlimited, which is a very significant organization today, and several other things. So now it's time to, okay, we're going to do YOU. This makes sense. 8 people around the table. We need to create a 501c3 organization. We need a board. Who should we ask to be on this board and run with it? Oh, Jim here. You know, he's run such. Oh yeah, great. Call him. You going to call him? We went around the table. I'm sitting there thinking, you know, that I didn't use the term then, person of color, but it's unlikely unless I pop up and say that anybody else is going to suggest someone. So I did. You know what the response was? Gee, that sounds pretty good. Yeah, you know, I think he might get his resume and bring it to the next meeting. Right? by sheer chance, that same day, I was in a board meeting, where at a point in the board meeting, the CEO says, we got this problem we're trying to deal, and we've got this guy we've located in Detroit, whose name couldn't be pronounced. We're going to give, I think we need to give him a $250,000 contract to do some strategic thinking around this, and I'd really like to do this. This is a person we all know and respect. Someone said, move it. Someone else said, second it. And I thought to myself, there's not one person in this room, other than a couple staff people, who have a clue who this person is, right? It's the CEO said, we need it, we want it. My stomach fell out. But afterwards, I went up and said, could I talk with you for a few minutes? Sure. Later, we went to the office, and I said, I want to replay my morning for you. Told the story. He didn't get it. So I had to tell it again. Okay. That was a dramatic changing point. My thing that I've constantly said around race and racism and so forth is, these are the moments, these are the times, these are the things that we're dealing with. I mean, hallelujah, we finally have got the Me Too movement, right?
Amen.
Okay. And now more of a time of stepping out and sort of saying, can't do that anymore. But we're getting a lot of pushback. And even given that, if we look at the data in terms of the number of women executives, the number of minority executives in Fortune 500 companies, in terms of many of the organizations that we deal with. So it's a lot different. It's not as overt, and I find that part challenging. And that's where, I mean, it takes the blunt instrument, but it takes folks who are sophisticated about managing relationships.
I think we are at the end of our time together. If you want more of Steve, I know of 3 different YouTube videos where he tells stories that are very good. I really can't thank you enough for your service and the whole theme of putting yourself out there, accepting the call, and being there when it counts, whether it's happenstance or not. You seem to have made a career of happy coincidence in many of your stories. And on behalf of a grateful community, I would say thank you for your continued service to this great city. So.